What's going on, guys? This is the STR Podcast, otherwise known as the Start to Rebuild Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Fournier, along co-host Ian Mills.
Hey, how you guys
Um,
doing?
so this is a brand new podcast, and we're talking about sports, primarily football and basketball, and we're here to give our genuine takes about sports and what we see. Ian, you want to continue on that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we want to give kind of, I guess we are a bit of kind of like film jicky kind of guys, but a little more than the casual fan. Trying to do a little bit more than just the Skip Bayless, Stephen A. Smith, kind of getting out of the entertainment realm of it. Although it will be entertaining, getting out of just saying stuff for reactions, more or less giving our honest opinions of how we truly feel about the sport and the players involved.
That's right. So today we thought we'd talk about a little bit about the NFL draft, specifically quarterbacks. We thought we'd go through a little bit of our rankings and what we come to on consensus and what we think about these players.
Yeah,
So, that being said, our number one quarterback, just like pretty much everyone else, is Joe Burrow. Great season at LSU, potentially the greatest season of all time at the quarterback position for a college player. Transferring from Ohio State, junior year wasn't great. I mean, it's not like he was horrible, but nowhere near where he is looked at now. He's a great player. He's got great feel. He's not necessarily got like the huge arm for a number one overall pick where he's some great physical specimen, but he's really got a great feel for picking spots and zones and putting the ball in the right spot, throwing the ball back shoulder. And that's why our comp for him is a little bit of Tony Romo with a little bit more upside. Like Tony Romo had a great career, but he's not looked at as one of the elite quarterbacks of his age. But we think Burrow can get into the echelon, but in a kind of Tony Romo-esque play style. Ian, you want to talk more about
yeah,
Burrow?
I think he does all the right things. And the biggest thing that comes to mind, especially after the national championship game, is even though he was a backup, where was it? JT Barrett's backup and then Dwayne Haskins' backup, he was still kind of like full of confidence. He's still like a kid that is extremely confident, as you should be after this year. And I think coming this year, when you think Tony Romo, you probably honestly at this point you probably think more of the commentator, but looking back at his days, he was an impressive quarterback. He put up impressive numbers just on not great teams with Jason Garrett at coach, who, as we know now, wasn't a great coach. So I think Joe Burrow is one of those guys who is he hopefully, I mean, if we're right, he will be one of the best quarterbacks in the league. But again, that depends on a lot of assuming the Bengals don't trade, a king or don't receive a king's ransom and actually do draft him this year or the first overall pick. I would think that it does have a lot to do with the surroundings around him, and that probably says more about the Bengals than it does him. I mean, you put any quarterback in that situation, they won't perform extremely well. So I think Tony Romo was probably the right comp here. Just from like a player, perspective, talent-wise, he could be better. Not that Romo was bad, but from a talent perspective, he could be better. But again, it's going to have a lot to do with the surroundings around him. So yeah, I think he's
Right.
the right
I
guy.
mean, when you hear Tony Romo as a comparison, you're not necessarily thinking like you're talking like this guy in the greatest light, like he's some like all-time great. But I think it's more like a play style type thing, and then it's not a knock on Romo either. He was a great player, and I think he was underrated in his career.
Yeah, he just couldn't win in the playoffs. But again, that's
Right,
not entirely his fault.
right. And back to what you were saying about confidence, I think that's a big part of the position. I think that's a big reason you and I both were high on Baker Mayfield coming out.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something to be said about like the it factor that people talk about. Um, and I think Joe Burrow has that.
Yeah, for sure.
Another thing, like we were talking about before, how we said we like to, like peel back the curtain and like get away from all like the media. Like, there's a lot of just garbage that comes out there, and people either just falling in line with things or just being outlandish and having crazy takes just to get clicks. And I think one thing that we talk about that you also kind of touched on, especially with quarterbacks, is people like to think that when you draft a quarterback that he is what he is, and if he's good, he's gonna be great, and if he's not good, he's gonna be horrible. But that fluctuates a lot based on where you land. And the Bengals, where he's most likely to be going, is not a great situation. So maybe that'll hurt his career.
At
Maybe they'll
least
get better, but we'll
I
see.
think, I think, I mean, maybe not a player comp, but a scenario situation. And maybe it's because it's Carson Palmer. When you look at his career, the three teams that stand out are obviously the Bengals, where he was up and down with Marvin Lewis, then the Raiders for that year with he went 0-16. I can't think of his name real quick, but Hugh Jackson. With Hugh Jackson, and he went 8-8 with Hugh Jackson. So whatever. And then again with Bruce Arians, who was kind of like a quarterback whisperer, had career years towards the end of his career. So it's one of those things where I think he's the perfect example of like a guy who was not in a good situation and made the best out of it. But when he was in a really good situation with Larry Fitzgerald, and those were David Johnson prime years, he was an MVP candidate.
He was awesome.
So it is one of those things where it's like with Burrow, it's scary going to the Bengals only because maybe they will mess it up like they did a little bit with Carson Palmer. Not that Carson Palmer was really that bad in Cincinnati, but yeah, I think his ceiling will be higher than what people think. Just because that he's on the Bengals, it could alter his path, at least at the beginning of his career.
And that's kind of what separates the top of the top elite guys, is when a quarterback can elevate the team around him and be in contention no matter what. What comes to mind right away is Russell Wilson this past season. Awesome player, hasn't played behind a good offensive line his whole career, it feels like. But he always just makes something happen. It doesn't matter. I think Burrow, he played with one of the most talented rosters in the entire country. So we haven't really seen what he can do without that. But, if he can bring this Bengals team, I think that solidifies him as
and Joe Brady's
could get into that level.
Joe Brady is an offensive coordinator now in the NFL, so that helps too. But yeah, I don't think that takes much away from Burrow. I still think he's an extremely talented quarterback. But that being said, he's the number one guy unless the Bengals trade and get a bunch of picks for him. Probably only destination is probably the Dolphins there. He'll go to the Bengals most likely at one.
Yeah. Just a common theme throughout this also is going to be landing spots, and that's really could make or break some of these guys' careers. We'll see how that keeps going. Ian, you want to start with our next guy?
Yeah. So number 2, we have Tua Tagovailoa. I still don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Tagovailoa. I've heard it 100 different ways.
Yeah. So simply known as Tua, the guy who took Jalen Hurts' career at Alabama. He's one of those guys where everyone wants to say injuries, injuries A, and then B, he had Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, a really good
Jalen Waddle, great line, Nick Saban.
So, again, that's a lot to that's a lot to be said about Alabama. But if you look at the numbers that Jalen Hurts had with that team, not that they were really bad. To get 14 touchdowns and a pick the year he got benched for Tua, but it's Tua's ability to actually be able to make decisions downfield, at least compared to Jalen Hurts. So he right now is our consensus number 2. Simply because again, if he sits for a year, which it's not necessarily likely that he will do it, but at least for a couple games probably, he's one of those guys where if he's healthy, he's up there with Burrow for sure.
Yeah. Just to go along with landing spots, what you were talking about, he might have to sit for a little bit. With his injury concerns and 2 very potential teams that he could go to, being the Chargers and Dolphins, who don't have great O-lines, could be definitely beneficial for him to sit for a little bit. the injuries we're talking about. He had the very, very serious hip injury that a lot of people are really worried about. That's the main one, but that's not the only thing he has. He's had ankle injuries, I believe. I think there's stories of him like breaking his wrist, just like in multiple times in like very like simple ways. That being said, we've seen guys be injury prone and then never have an injury in the league, and we've seen guys never have an injury and then come into the league and get hurt all the time. And a lot of people like to talk about how they think a bigger quarterback won't be as injury prone, but then there's guys like Carson Wentz and Ben Roethlisberger that seem to get hurt all the time, and
I mean,
Russell
Cam
Wilson
Newton.
who never gets hurt. So going with comparisons, I'd like to say with our comparisons, sometimes we like to compare them based on play style. Sometimes we like to compare them based on how we think their career will go. Sometimes we like to compare them based on the impact they have. And our comparison for Tua is Dak Prescott because we think he's the type of quarterback that if he's in a bad situation and doesn't have the greatest surrounding core, he might not necessarily elevate them to be like a contender. Like we saw Dak Prescott fall off a little bit this year. O-line's not as great as it was when he was a rookie. But when he was a rookie, the Cowboys were contenders. They were winning. They almost beat the Packers in the divisional?
Yep, when they had the bye, yep.
Mm-hmm. But they are a great, great team. So when he has a surrounding core, he can execute and make that a really, really good contending team. But he's not necessarily going to elevate a team like a Russell Wilson and bring bottom of the barrel teams into contention. Ian, if you want to keep going.
Yeah, I think with him, for me personally, I think it makes more sense I mean, obviously he doesn't have a choice in it, but I like the Chargers trading up 2 spots in front of the Dolphins and taking him at 4 because of the fact that
they'll probably have to trade. They could trade with the Giants. I mean, the big rumors have been the Lions moving down.
That's true.
And them still getting Okuda, but I mean, the Giants could. I mean, especially where it seems like they really like taking an offensive tackle. They feel like they could still get 1 at 6. That could definitely happen.
Well, because the thing is, I feel like if they do trade with the Giants, I mean, then you have Chargers 4, Dolphins 5, and you assume the Dolphins go with the quarterback. Again, that's not a guarantee by any means, but
with 3 first-round picks, who knows?
Yeah. So the way I see it with Tua is I think Anthony Lynn, as even back to his years as offensive coordinator with the Bills, was an incredible running game. And with him, I mean, obviously the Chargers have Tyrod this year. Tyrod, who was with Anthony Lynn in Buffalo, and it's one of those guys where I think he's going to be able to take the load off of the quarterback. And I know we know the Chargers don't have an amazing run game, but they do have a great receiving core. Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Travis Benjamin, who's a pretty good slot guy, and then Hunter Henry at tight end, who when he's healthy is actually very good. So I see it, Tyrod, starting. If I know that the Browns tried to do it, but there's a huge difference between taking a guy with the first overall pick, like the Browns did with Baker Mayfield, and then expecting a team that hasn't won in 20 years to be okay with benching that guy. Regardless. Tyrod, I think he's a perfect quarterback to start in front of a quarterback who, Tua is a young guy. He's a redshirt sophomore, I want to say. So he's one of those guys where, sitting for a year, especially with his injury concerns, and then allowing in the next offseason or making trades to get a better offensive line. I mean, Austin Eckler is awesome, not just in the running game, but in the receiving game as well. Yeah, so it's one of those things where it's like you put a quarterback in that elevate, you have a system that can elevate the quarterback. And I think Tua is a perfect situation there because, the running game, he will have to rely on that heavily. I think at least, the first year or two, simply because of the fact
they got Justin Jackson there from Northwestern. Yeah. He's pretty decent. I mean, drafts next week, they could easily find someone else if they're really looking for another player. I mean, I think the run game can be important, but sometimes who you have at the backfield isn't nearly as important as the scheme and the blocking in front of you. But
I think Anthony Lynn has that I think he has the right scheme for it at least. And I mean
Yeah,
that
he's been great in the past at least.
yeah.
Just some background with that. Ian and I both grew up in upstate New York, so Tyrod Taylor is definitely a fan favorite.
Yes. He
Former
is close
Bill.
to our heart. He is close to our heart, yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Real quick.
So, um, so I think that's it with Tua. Be interesting to see where he goes.
And the
Um,
Dolphins are also a possibility there
mhm.
if they don't trade up. But
There's some rumors going around right now that he could potentially fall in the draft, mostly because of the injury concerns. Um,
or there
and
are
love
I've
for
seen,
Jordan or Justin Herbert.
yeah.
So we could see, but that could also definitely be smoke screens, teams trying to make sure he falls to them. You never know.
Yeah.
It's kind of you can never really trust things that come
Yeah.
out about the draft, especially 1 week before it happens.
One thing to keep in mind about quarterbacks in the draft is player teams will trade up, but they likely won't trade down for a guy, right? So I wouldn't expect, a team like if the Dolphins or the Chargers love him, I wouldn't expect them, to wait at if the Chargers are at 5, I wouldn't expect them to trade down to like 8 and take him. You know what I mean? Like I expect them if they want him, they will take him at 5 or
Oh
above.
yeah, I think, in my
At least,
opinion,
yeah,
if you want Tua, or even if you're really in love with Herbert, and you're the Dolphins or Chargers, you really gotta think about trading up to 3 with the Lions
yeah.
potentially, because you don't know what the other team's thinking right there, and they're
We saw it last
back-to-back
year.
picks. One's got to jump the other. One's got to have insurance, and you can't mess around with quarterbacks.
We saw that last year with Daniel Jones going at 6 in front of
Mm-hmm.
Josh Allen. Everyone
Seems
was
like
like,
there's a
"Why did
lot of
they do?"
mind games.
And it's like, yeah, it's like, well, you don't want to risk not getting your guy.
Exactly. All right, so our third quarterback on the list,
The
Jordan Love,
controversial
Utah State. He's definitely one of my
polarity.
guys and our guys. We both like him a lot. For me, I really liked him after watching his season 2 years ago. It's really exciting to watch him this year. He kind of struggled a little bit this year. Um, his team just didn't have a lot of NFL talent on it. He had new coaching staff. He kind of had a really bad situation this past season, but he's super talented. Arguably the best arm talent in the draft. Just questions about decision making, but yet again, you never know because of the team he had around him. We'll see. So the comp we had for him was kind of tough because he's one of those new age quarterbacks that we're starting to see more and more of. Um, and it's really tough to come with a comparison with him when he has such like a unique arm. And like first thought is you see articles about him all the time about how he's the next Patrick Mahomes, but that's really high praise to say he's comparable to the
The
best
new
quarterback in
player.
the NFL right now. So play style wise, I could see that. Weakness wise, he's got a little bit of Jameis Winston, with the decision making. But he makes throws that players in this draft just can't make, and he's special. We'll see about him. Ian, if you want to continue on him.
Yeah, I think with the Pat Mahomes comp, I don't mind it so much because looking at it, coming into the draft, it was 3 years ago with Pat Mahomes. You know, it was similar issues where it was like,
Mhm.
yeah, he has great arm strength, great great size, but it is the decision making. It's one of those things where it's like everyone compared him to Brett Favre because he was like a gunslinger.
Mhm.
He is a gunslinger, but it's I don't mind the comp for Pat Mahomes only because I think it's a very similar situation to when
Mhm.
Pat Mahomes was coming out. Obviously, Pat Mahomes had a much better final year in college than Jordan Love did. But that being said, I mean, with the concerns really being decision making. And staring receivers down as he did. But there are snippets of him. Like if you go back to the Akron Bowl game, which they lost, But if you go back to the Akron Rebellion, I think they scored over 40 points a game. And there were plays in that game where he's making throws that I don't like. It's hard to see a lot of NFL quarterbacks make.
To go along with that, he played LSU this year. And a lot of people point to that as being like a real game where you should be evaluated highly on because you're playing some of the best competition you'll play. And people just look at the box score and they see he threw like 3 picks that game, I want to say. And people say he doesn't play well, but he didn't play well. But if you go back and you watch that game, he is doing the absolute best he can. And then at the end of the game, he's throwing picks because he's having to force because you're down 3 scores and you got to press the issue and you got to try and do something. Like, that's a game that you can really see that that Utah State is just completely outmatched physically. And so I truly think he didn't really even play that bad that game. And then at the end, he had some plays that just, make his box score look worse. But that being said, you watch his tape and you see him make a really, really late throw on like an out route that like maybe it's because he knows he has such a great arm that he gets kind of lazy on that stuff. And, it only takes 2 or 3 plays a game where you get like that. And then before you know it, you're down 3 scores and who knows. So he's a really, really talented player. I think we were talking about before, like, he could be maybe somewhere along the spectrum of a Jameis Winston to Mahomes. Like, it's crazy saying that his upside could be Mahomes. I'm not telling you right now that he's going to be the next Patrick Mahomes. But he's got that talent where he can make plays that other players in the league just can't make.
I think he's going to be one of those guys where he goes to a team like the Pats or the Packers or the Saints, which we were talking about beforehand.
I think he's got to sit for a year or 2.
Yeah, he's going to, again, it's similar to the Mahomes, where I think it could be one of those years where it's like he sits all 16 years or 16 games, or the first 15 games.
Yeah, Mahomes started week 17 against the Broncos.
Right? Yeah, so if he is benched behind, I mean, Rodgers, Brady, and Breeze are some of the best to do it. I mean, not that Alex Smith is a good quarterback, but there's a huge difference between Alex Smith and, Brady or whatever it is. Actually, I guess the Patriots don't have Brady anymore. So Patriots, if they pick him, Stidham would probably be their starter. And I think at that point, if Stidham's not performing well, you kind of have to force the issue with Love. So maybe not the Patriots now that I'm thinking about it. But so, I mean, he's a guy who –
This guy, I just really like him.
I do too, but I think again, if you're going to sit him for a year, I think you have to sit him for a year, pretty much.
And I think it could really benefit him being behind. In the general public, it's mostly Burrow and then a combination of Tua or Herbert for the top 3. And I think it could really benefit him if he slid and goes in the back half of the first round and goes to a better situation. And he could have a huge impact once he's eventually ready to get on the field. A place that he could go with maybe like the Saints and give the Saints a new vertical element that, Breeze is great right now when he really slices up defense in the intermediate range, but, they could bring the Saints to a whole new level in a few years once he's done. Packers at the end of the first, if he falls that far, I just really like him. I mean, there's also the idea that he could go to a team. I really like him going to a team that has multiple first-round picks.
With the Jags
from the team standpoint, like the Jags, like you just said, 2 first-round picks. He could go to them with their second pick, and then sit behind Minshew until he's ready. I don't know if that'd be the best situation for him, but I would like that pick for the Jaguars because I think he can really have a huge impact once he's ready. I really, really like this player. Again, it's tough coming up with a comp because he's such a unique player because he's so talented. But we'll see how this goes. You got anything else on Jordan Love, Ian?
I just want to say real quick, we'll probably touch on it more in the next slide, but the reason we have Jordan Love – the reason we have Jordan Love above Justin Herbert is I think probably just like from a talent perspective. But again, we'll get that more – get into that more with Herbert. So if you want to go to the next slide. So Justin Herbert, pretty much the 2 or 3 guy in most guys' or most people's books.
I think Love over Herbert is where we differ
Yeah,
from
the
the
norm at least.
general public and like mock drafts and stuff. There's definitely plenty of people who aren't in love with Herbert. I'll tell you that. I see that all the time where people are really, really low on Herbert. And there are some people that really like Love and some people that don't. But I mean, general consensus is it looks like Herbert should go ahead of him, but you never know what can happen.
Yeah, our player comp for Herbert is like a Ryan Tannehill type of guy, where it's like he needs, a good system, a good coach, a good surrounding around him, like Tannehill did have this year, to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we both agree he could be a competent NFL quarterback and a good NFL starting quarterback, but just like if you plug and play right now with like the Dolphins, I don't know how well it will go. You know what I mean?
Right.
So with him, again, the biggest thing that comes out is kind of the arm strength. But in college, 23% of his passes, which is I think most of within the past few years, so 23% of his passes last year were screens. Which again, that has a lot to say about Oregon. But it's one of those things where it's like it does kind of concern you. I mean, watching him outside of the arm strength, the accuracy isn't necessarily there. The decision making isn't perfect, but he did play in a really good system this year. So I think because of that, his draft stock has risen at least a little bit. And I think coming into the year, he was still pretty high up. I think he was projected a first round guy coming into the year too, and he didn't really have a bad year by any means. So because of that, he probably hasn't changed much, I think.
The other thing about Herbert, kind of the same thing that we saw with Josh Rosen, is he kind of like burst onto the scene and he was like really good for a young guy, and then he just kind of never got better. He's just
Yeah.
the same. Which we kind of saw from Josh Rosen, and then it becomes like, oh, he's just kind of like a projection now, like he's like a really toolsy guy. Another comp I had for him was Jared Goff, where if he's put in a great situation with a great coach and a great surrounding core, he can make any throw you're asking him to make. When it comes to having to play off script, he looks lost. But he's still got that big arm, prototypical size. He's a pretty good athlete. I wouldn't say like you're drafting him for any type of athleticism, but he can move a little bit. Pocket awareness, I don't think is great. He just doesn't look like he has a great feel for the game. He looks like he's just like we talked about Burrow before with like it factor. Like you just see something in the guy. And Herbert, it's just like nothing. Like it just feels like he's out there and he's just kind of doing what the coach is telling him, and he's just kind of like an extension of the coach. But he's just got this rocket arm that scouts are going to fall in love with, and teams will love, and that's why they have him so high. I know we're talking like really negative about him right now. It's just, I mean, if he's put in a good situation, I think he can succeed. But I don't see him ever being in the conversation for like a top 10 quarterback that people really look at like he's great, which I think some people really like him, and I don't know. I just don't see it with him. That's why he's a little lower on ours. That being said, if he falls, I think he's a value in the second half of the first round because, that's another thing that I like to talk about. Kind of pulling back from the general idea of the draft is everyone likes to think they know what they have in a guy and their evaluation is correct, and that's the end of the talk. But there's a lot of guesswork that involves in the draft. There's players that go way later that no one ever talked about that end up becoming amazing, and there's players that you really think are going to be good and they can't miss, and then they don't do anything. So there's a big part of the draft that's just taking your shot. And if the player has tools, then he could potentially become a good player if you put him in the right situation. So I think with Herbert, he's kind of an interesting kind of player where he's got all the tools, but I don't know if he just has it.
Yeah, I
I
think
just don't love him at the top of the first round.
I think that he won't carry a team,
Mhm.
but he'll probably end up with the Dolphins or the Chargers. And it really depends on if the Chargers trade up. I mean, who they want more, Tua or Herbert.
That's
And
where
with
he's looking where
Herbert,
he's going to go.
yeah. So with Herbert, again, maybe it's because of the offensive mind thing, but I do prefer him with the Chargers simply because of the fact where I feel like, I do think he's kind of more of a, put him into a team. Like I don't necessarily think that he has to be benched for an entire year. Although it probably will be beneficial if he sits a couple games. But it's one of those things where I feel like kind of with Jared Goff and Sean McVay, where it's like kind of similar with Anthony Lynn, where I feel like he can, actually elevate this quarterback's play. Even if he isn't the most amazing, decision-making quarterback in the world. With the Dolphins, it's Brian Flores is a good coach, but he is a defensive guy. Ryan Fitzpatrick is kind of like a gunslinger type, and I don't think that's necessarily what Justin Herbert needs to learn. Like I don't think he needs to learn how to make worse decisions. Then again, Fitzpatrick has seen it all. He's a veteran guy, so he is probably a very valuable, very very valuable starter and mentor for any young quarterback. Um, so I don't hate either of them. I do think he'll probably will go in the top 10 just because that's the way it looks like things will shape out. Not that I think he will, or not that I think he should, but he probably will. So, I mean, either of those teams I don't hate for him. I like Jordan Love more, and so do I like Tua more as well. But if the Chargers are really like, we need a guy to start week one, Herbert probably makes more sense than Love or Tua.
Um, I might have to disagree with you there on Tua. Assuming injuries are fine, I
Oh
think
yeah,
Tua is more of a day one
fair enough.
starter.
Yeah,
I think personally, I think Herbert should definitely have to sit. Like you were talking about before, I do think Tyrod is a capable starter for sure. Just overall, I think thoughts on Herbert. Going back to my Goff comparison, I think within structure, if he's got a great surrounding core, like I said, and a good coach, he could have some success. As did Goff, but he'll never reach that upper echelon, just as Goff has not reached there. And if he's not in a great situation like Goff was with Jeff Fisher, we could really see some inconsistencies and just overall not
yeah,
great play.
yeah.
And that brings us to our next and fifth quarterback on our list, and that is Jake Fromm from Georgia.
Yeah. So Fromm obviously had a phenomenal freshman year, and then dropped off kind of the next 2 years just a little bit. And not that he really was like horrible, but he did drop off a little bit. He's one of those guys where we both kind of agree the comp is like a game managing quarterback,
Mm-hmm.
similar to Alex Smith or Kyle Orton type, or even like
And it's tough with him because it's hard to separate between is that his play style or is that more of Georgia's play style being
smart.
one of the more run heavy offenses. Um, that's tough to separate, but from what we've seen, excuse me, he does kind of have that game manager feel like you were talking about.
Yeah. Again, yeah. I mean, again, that could be due to the reason. That could just be us thinking that because Georgia has been very good for the last 3 years, while he hasn't put up incredible numbers. Not that they've been bad, but it is kind of a number. It is kind of a thing where it's like he doesn't throw the ball downfield exceptionally well. He's a guy who doesn't, make too many errors. Like he won't throw, more than probably 16 picks in a year unless he's having an exceptionally bad year. Um, but I think it is kind of like you'll take him or you'll play with him and do well with him if you have the right surroundings around him. So with
Mhm.
him, with a guy like that, the easy answer would be a team that's really really good, or has surroundings or has coaches around them like the Packers or the Saints. But either team, he would probably
I
have to
think a
sit.
great team for him would be the Patriots.
Yeah, I mean Belichick knows
Um,
what he's doing, and they have a good offensive line.
mhm.
Um, But yeah, I mean, it really is gonna be interesting to see where he goes because a lot of people have Eason in front of Fromm. But personally, we just see Fromm is a more of a competent NFL starting quarterback.
Based on all that, our comp is Alex Smith, which is a pretty popular comp for him. I think he could really do well in the Patriots system, as I just mentioned. Really doing well in the intermediate game. But he can also, have one of those Alex Smith years, his last year in Kansas City, where he started pushing the ball down the field a lot more. I don't think Fromm. A lot of people say he just doesn't have a great arm at all. I think it's overstated how weak his arm is. I think it's it's a capable NFL arm. It's
Yeah,
not like
I
a
agree with
huge
that.
weakness that he has.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I think he's just a smart, heady player, and he can execute an offense. And I think he can be a decent player in this league and could be a long-time starter for a team that likes him. Like I said, Patriots could really turn this guy into a really good player.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So
All
for
right.
our last guy, I'll let Ian take the show. This is
Okay.
his guy that he really wants to mention. I'll let you introduce him.
So if you guys watch a lot, if you guys gamble a lot, right? If you bet a lot of money on random college football games, you're in love with this guy,
Mm-hmm.
Cole McDonald. He won me a lot of money this year, and look, I don't think he's necessarily our 6th ranked guy. Our notable guys that we have probably in front of him include Eason and Hurts, where sorry, and Hurts, and even we talked about Anthony Gordon before this. Well, Cole McDonald, he's one of those guys where he's coming out as a junior. He has another year of eligibility, and it does kind of confuse me why he did come out. His numbers were really good this year, and if you watched him, he was a mobile.
He slings it.
Yeah, he's a very mobile quarterback with a strong arm, and especially in the intermediate passing game. He will be probably a late round pick. So I feel like he probably should have stayed, another year and potentially could have been one of those top 5 quarterbacks for next year. That being said, I think he could come in and be a backup to a team and, provide relief and actually, make a difference for some teams.
I think he's a really interesting player and worth a flyer later on in the draft for sure.
Yeah, whether it's this year or in the future, he will probably start an NFL game at some point, and it will be interesting to see how he actually does.
For sure.
I don't necessarily have a great comp for him, but I mean, he has a pretty strong arm. He's a very mobile guy, tall, and he is kind of a gunslinger. So comes to mind. I hate to say it because I say it a lot. Josh Allen does come to mind. Again, there's a difference between the two because one is a first round size, first round talent. Cole McDonald isn't necessarily, but just from like a play style, he kind of comes to mind. But then again, I mean, with this guy, I think he's a accurate enough quarterback. But again, the only reason I kind of want to mention him was because I feel like no one has mentioned him in this whole draft analysis type of thing, and he is a.
It kind of just seems to be the guy that people joke about because of his hair, and he plays at
Hawaii. Yeah, but he's actually pretty good. I mean, he didn't have Colt Brennan type of numbers, but Colt Brennan wasn't anything in the NFL, so it's
he's a guy we're going to be rooting for.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And who knows? Maybe he could have a type of. I was talking about this before, like a Gardner Minshew type of impact where no one's really thinking about him. A starter gets hurt and he goes in and then he shocks everyone. I don't think they necessarily have the same type of
play style
ranks.
Yeah.
I think Cole McDonald actually has a better arm than Minshew. But Minshew doesn't have the strongest arm, but he finds a way to make it work and sling the ball around, even going deep too. Without this stronger arm, he's just really accurate. And I think maybe not the same play style with Cole McDonald, but he's the same type of player that could maybe step in and have that type of impact that we really like.
Let's just hope Cole McDonald makes me a lot more money in the future. That's all I hope.
That's right. So we just wanted to touch on the quarterbacks we didn't have on our list. being notable ones being, like you said before, Jalen Hurts,
Jacob
Jacob
Eason,
Eason,
yeah.
uh,
Anthony Gordon a little
Anthony
bit.
Gordon.
Nate Stanley.
Those are guys we didn't really have on our list because we're not in love with them. If you need a quarterback, maybe they're worth taking a flyer on. We don't hate them, but we're not really planting our flag for those guys. We're
Yeah.
not super confident in them.
The most
We just kind of threw Cole McDonald in there because he's our guy, and we really want to see him be something.
Yeah. Out of that group, probably Jalen Hurts is the most intriguing, but that's probably because he is potentially a trick style type of player, kind of like Slash back in the 2000s, or with Taysom Hill. He's not a big guy like Taysom Hill, but similar effects of him in the NFL, at least for the first couple of years. He has to work on his accuracy, but I mean, he is a winner. He knows how to win. He makes good decisions, but again, the accuracy it really isn't there. At least it wasn't there at the college level. If you watch the Oklahoma LSU game, obviously LSU, as we're talking about, isn't like they're one of the better defenses in college football, obviously. So
Great secondary.
they're not a great base test, but there are plays where he's just missing CeeDee Lamb wide open. On like 5-yard slant. So I mean, there has with him maybe down the line, but again,
I think he's one of those guys that'll be like a career backup that is a great locker room guy.
Yeah,
and he'll give you a spot start here and there, and he won't blow you the game. And maybe his future is kind of Tyrod Taylor-esque, that type of player. Mostly a backup. I don't know if he'll get as good of a chance as Tyrod, where Tyrod started for a few years, but I think he's a player that coaches will really like to have on their team. For sure. And then just on Eason, he's got the big arm. He was beat out by Jake Fromm at Georgia and then transferred to Washington. He's kind of in like the Herbert range. He's got like the big arm. He's got the tools. The team might like to take a flyer on him. We'll see with him. Ian and I aren't huge fans of his game, but never know. We don't hate him. Don't love him.
I didn't catch too many Washington games this year, but when I think of a Washington quarterback, I think Jake Browning. Obviously, he's not in the NFL, or he could be on the practice squad for all I know, but it was one of those guys where it's just like Washington guys seem to put up big numbers, and then not do too much.
And we don't have huge opinions on him, partly because we didn't see him a lot, and we don't want to sit here and say we know everything about him.
Yeah, we don't want to say bad things about him if we don't
about everything about his play style. That's right. So going forward with this podcast, I don't know, Ian, if we want to touch on what we're gonna try and do in the future.
So probably something similar to this. We'll see the response we get. Change up, probably, do a little more basketball. Obviously, this episode's just strictly football. We might try to get into a couple of segments into every episode rather than just honing on this one. But, right now when there's no sports going on and the only thing that's coming up is the draft, it's, kind of like the only thing to talk about. We will try to talk about more basketball. We haven't talked about it, but we could probably do about 2 episodes a week or more, depending on, at least right now, because we're only, kind of home all the time. But once school starts back up, or once we actually get back to school, which will be in a couple months, that might change. But for the time being, I think two or 3 is manageable.
For sure. Just about specific content, like Ian said, we're gonna be football and basketball. We'll get into topics like this. Draft rankings, of course, is big. Ian and I like to look out on a lot of sports betting. Maybe we'll give advice about that. We'll keep you updated with what we're looking at. But just general topics. We'll come out with new stuff every week. Leave any comments about what you want to see in the future. We might try and get something out one more time before the draft next week, and we'll for sure get our reactions and grades about draft picks after next week's draft.
Yeah, all right. I think that's all we have for today. Thank you for
All right.
tuning in.
Yep.
And yeah, make sure to subscribe to the channel and on podcast, on Spotify, or on Apple Music, whatever we end up getting that onto. Thanks for watching.
See you guys.